Welcome to Worth Quoting, sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Mary Sue Koeppel, the editor of Calliope, a professor at FCCJ, and with me this afternoon is Elizabeth Seydel Morgan, who asked me to call her Buffy.
That's right.
Welcome. We're so pleased that you're here in Jacksonville, and
Thank you.
it's great to see you. I just saw your latest book called Parties, which for some time has been out of print. You published it last year in 1988, and it's already out of print. To what can you attribute such wonderful, wonderful salesmanship?
Well, I have a lot of friends, like my friends here in Jacksonville, who have happened to have attended the same college I went to, and I attribute a lot of the sales in my book to that fact that I went to Hollins College in Virginia, which my shirt will testify to at some point. These friends of mine around, it's certainly on the eastern seaboard, have invited me to come to their towns, and that has accounted for some of the sales. The other reason is that they're so fantastically good.
Of course. No, and I'm not saying that with irony or satire.
Poetry is hard to sell, that's true. And even though this was a small edition, which all publishers will narrow their editions of poetry because they don't expect for it to be on the New York Times bestseller list or anywhere else like that. And they'll limit the edition, but it's, I think that my poems are more accessible than people are used to who read contemporary poetry. Poetry written today sometimes eludes the understanding of the reader, and people don't like that. They don't like to read what they don't understand. And I think another thing, Sue, is that that my poetry, written by a woman, an older woman who's writing about experiences of being a woman, has touched a market probably among women, although a lot of men have bought my book. I've signed them for them. I think it's just touched something in women that they like to read about experiences that they themselves have been through and wanted to be able to put into words. And
So you find a lot of identification as people read your poems. Do they tell you so?
Oh,
Do they write you letters?
Oh, yes, yes.
Telling you these
Come up
wonderful
to me
things?
after readings and say, that's the way I felt when my husband died. I, for instance, had written a poem. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a good friend, and I tried to put myself in her persona and express the feelings that she might have had. And that's just one example.
You mentioned your shirt. Tell us about your shirt.
Oh, well,
People are probably very curious, like watching.
This is a Hollins College Creative Writing T-shirt, which I have just come from a reading at a Hollins Club function here in Jacksonville. And these shirts were handed out at a reunion at Hollins College where all of the people who have been through their creative writing program or have been English majors and took creative writing were all there. And we have a lot of famous people. I think maybe Annie Dillard, who wrote Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, is a good example. Lee Smith and Jill McCorkle. There's just a lot of writers who've come out of this very small college in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. So
Makes you proud, I bet.
we're all very happy about it.
Annie Dillard was here and probably sitting in your chair a couple of years ago. Yeah, Calliope also sponsored her coming. It was a delight also.
Yeah, she's a wonderful writer.
One of the things that I'm going to ask you to do before we really get into talking about your poetry is please read for us a poem or two. I know that if I were sitting in a chair at home watching this on television, I'd be very interested and curious about the kind of poetry that you write. And since it hasn't been available in the bookstores until, what, today? It's,
That's right.
yeah, I think it would be nice to be able to offer that to the viewers. You're
Thank
going
you.
to read for us?
The paperback has been available. I guess it's the
hardback we
hardcover
can't
that
get,
has just gone into the second printing. And this is, as I told you before the program, this is the first time I've seen it since November. I mean, it's the first time I've seen this. So
It's a thrill.
thank you all who brought it here today. You mentioned one that you had read yourself and that you asked me to read, so I'll be happy to. This poem is called All My Friends' Pets Are Growing Old.
Don't we know that?
Which certainly came from my experience. Our 18-year-old cat was seeing her last days, much to the sorrow of my 3 children and all the family. And then I noticed that everybody else I knew had a dog or a cat or or pet. And of course, what that suggested, I'll let the poem speak for itself.
Right.
It has a light touch. The poem, the title itself is light, but of course underneath I hope that,
Right.
that the seriousness comes through. This is a poem that is not my voice. This is a poem which we poets call a persona poem, where I've put myself into the voice of a person who doesn't really like animals and is protesting about all these people worrying about their animals. All my friends' pets are growing old. Mike's clawless, scabby cat can't roam outside for fear the blue jays she once mocked will strike and peck her sores. So Mike picks up the turds from his prized rugs with only mild disgust and smiles at Tiger sleeping in a shaft of sun. Barbara said at lunch the other day she's lugging her black lab with help to push him up into the car, weekly to the vet's for shots, and every Tuesday he plays dead at 2 o'clock. I thought how much I'd hate a week with such a time tied to it. I didn't like her dog when he was frisky. I did like Millie's corgi, who looked old when he was new. But I hate the way she talks now of his cancer as if he were a relative or friend. Bob and Connie Kincaid are the worst with their menagerie, a house that reeks of cat piss, 2 huge wheezing dogs and one with heartworm, a hamster worn to lumpiness from running round in circles, a toothless rabbit, Aphrodite, they coax to suck a bottle and talk. That's all they do is talk of all the trouble they go to. So smug, the way they're trying to suggest they do the same for anyone. And the part I really cannot bear, they trick me into talking about Whitlock Street, where we couples stood around somebody's small backyard, grilling sirloins, sipping beer, a nudge or hug to go with watching Millie's puppy waddle grass high toward the plump legs of our diapered babies.
Such a commentary on growing old.
Yes.
Reminds me of the Robert Frost poem about the old dog that barked backwards
Yes.
without looking up.
I could remember when he was a pup.
Ah.
It's a short
I
poem. That's it. That's
yes,
the whole
that's
poem.
it. That's the
yeah.
whole poem, 2 lines. I told my students about your poem about growing old, and they kind of looked at me as if, but I'm young, I'm young. And so I said to them, but you can watch your own pets, right? The pet that you had when you were 3 or 4 is now going to the vet and dying. And even an 18 or a 19-year-old has those experiences, sometimes younger kids even. It's a good way to talk about maturity.
Mm-hmm. And I think making up this person who's looking down on the whole process as she talks about how dumb all this is, that other people care so much about their aging or dying pets. And yet when she thinks back to her own children, she gives it all away, that she too is caught up in that time.
Absolutely.
Moving.
Beautifully done. You have another one for us?
All right. Just right next door to that one is a poem called Heron, which is a poem, a more serious vein, that is actually based on an experience that I had. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and I don't live anywhere near any place that a great blue heron could be would be living or would nest. And yet one day I woke up and looked out the window of my house, and there was this heron. I think down here in your area you're more used to seeing very great birds like that, but I'm not. And it stood there in my yard, as the poem talks about. And it came after the experience. I felt that I had to write a poem about it, and it had to mean something, that you don't just look out your window and see a heron in your yard very often. And I tried to work it into the kinds of things that happen in our lives that are meaningful just for that at that one time, and that's what I've tried to do here. It's called Heron. The moment between what wasn't and what is has to shock like the instant I saw the 3-foot heron perched like a prank in my front yard. I've known a few enunciations. My God, I'm in love was one, and the bloodied baby's head between my thighs. Then my thin son with a suitcase, losing resolution in my rearview mirror. The elegant heron stood in my yard, in my cluttered neighborhood, miles from water, fish, its kind, It curled and uncurled its neck, scanning the air for bearings. All morning I thought it would fly away. By afternoon I was afraid it never would. Who could miss this incongruous sight? Everyone who passed by did. Walkers, drivers, runners, children never noticed the great blue heron dying by my Pontiac. It stood there all day long, bearing its weight on legs as frail as marsh grass.
Nice. Sometimes I feel as if it's kind of inappropriate to talk after a poem like that.
Well, most people who talk after that particular poem, it's not that old, but I've read it a few times in the last year to audiences, and most of them want to know what happened. And what happened is that the great blue heron died. It had been poisoned by toxic waste, according to the experts that I'd called to come see why it was just standing there. It was not frightened by anything that happened, but it was disoriented. But of course, that's not the poem.
No.
That's a sad story, and I could really make a case for it at my local anti-pollution or Keep the James River Clean Committee, which is the river in Richmond.
The poem,
But for poetry, it needed to end with the heron still standing.
of course. It's the beautiful first line. How does it go again?
The moment between what wasn't and what is
Yes.
has to shock.
Yes. And
Those
that
are the
poem-
first two lines.
And that poem shocks.
Well, that's what I think that's what poetry does. In an earlier draft of this poem, the name of the poem was Poetry.
Ah, yes.
And
It makes me ask this question, where do you find your images? It's as if the heron was in your yard, the cats, the dogs, the dying animals are in your friends' porches or houses. But from that comes a wonderful statement about the meaning of life. Is that how you find your images, kind of
Yeah.
looking around life?
you know, I used to think that everybody in the world thought metaphorically.
Uh-huh.
I think everything I see, I think, reminds me of something else.
Uh-huh.
I compare it. When I saw the heron, it wasn't just a heron, it was
Right.
something else. And I think that there's just some people who think, now I know that everybody doesn't think that way. I'm a teacher, I've been teaching all my life, and I know that most of my students do not think metaphorically.
Do you think it would be good if they could?
No, it's very confusing.
Ah, you have this wonderful quote about a genius. Would you tell us?
A genius?
Yes.
I don't know. But
Here I have, I think if I can find it here.
I hope I didn't
A
say it.
genius is one who can keep two contradictory ideas in his head at the same time.
Well, I did say that. I was under duress. I was given a reading at the Virginia Military Institute to a room full of 300 men in uniform.
Ah,
So I felt I had to say some intellectual things between poems.
and did they pay attention?
They
then?
were wonderful. It was one of the best audiences I've ever had, and I was terrified because a professor at VMI had spoken to me at dinner before I was to read and said, "Now, do you have any poems that could relate to the cadet experience?" And I said, "To the what?"
Uh-huh.
And he said, "The cadet experience." And you can tell my poems are not quite about that. But those young men are people too, and they understood. They were a real wonderful audience. But I did say that at that
Yes.
occasion, and I was trying to point out to them the two ideas I wanted them to hold in their heads at the same time, which contradict each other, is that everything that a poet writes is from real life, and nothing a poet writes is from real life. Those are two contradictory ideas, obviously.
Which is very related to your metaphorical thinking, which is so confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, people, when my book came out, there's some poems in here that are very sexy, to be frank about it. One of them, the name of it is Sex. That's getting down to the nitty-gritty. But people in Richmond, my friends, would say, "Now, is that one about Frank Johnson?" And I'd say, "What?" Or different poems that
Sure.
had people in them. For instance, the people in the poem about the animals, I've made all those people
course.
up, except for one of them is myself, who had the cat that would leave droppings on the rug. But the fact is that they're all really about me in some way, or about something that's happened. and yet none of them are really true exactly to my memory or to my knowledge of people. So that's the contradictory idea that you hold in your head at all times. And I'll bet that's true for all writers.
Absolutely.
And I think that even novels like Peachtree Road, some of us were just talking about, in which obviously Ann Siddons has used real people in Atlanta in her novel, Peachtree Road, but I don't think it's fair to pin down an exact equivalence to each person in that kind of fiction.
Yeah. What made you write?
I just always wanted to write ever since I was very little. I started reading when I was real young, about 3 or something, and just wanted to. I loved books. I used to make up covers like this and write, "She lives with her mother and daddy at this address," and then, you know, draw little pictures of myself on the back, and I never knew I'd really have one.
With your picture
It took me a
on the
long time, but I did used to do that when I was little. It was a fantasy. So, and then, as I say, I went to this college where creative writing was one of the major activities, and that just enforced what I already wanted to do.
What I enjoy about reading women's literature is that sometimes their themes, as you just mentioned, are not the themes that appeal to the cadets, but you're writing to a human being. What would you say are your themes?
Human relationships.
Sex.
Absolutely, that's one of the major things that keeps human relationships going.
And death.
Death, birth. I have 2 poems in here about birth of my own children, and death, separation, loss. I have several poems in the book about my relationship with my mother, which I think, whether you are a man or a woman, your relationship with your mother, as Freud pointed out, among others, is a very important one. And so, yeah, I think certainly that to me is more important than nature or pure philosophy without human beings attached to it, or pure spiritual subjects without earth attached to it.
People know you as an autobiographical poet. What does that mean to you?
Well, it's just what I said earlier, that yes, things I've written are based on either actual events or friends or just the things that have happened in my life. But I have a poem in here called Shakedown Time in the Pine Forest, in which the speaker is a forester whose job in life is in Louisiana to climb up pine trees and attach belts to them which generate an energy to the tree that makes it shake, and that makes the pine cones fall down from the trees, and that's my whole poem. Now, I have never done any such thing, so that's not autobiographical. It's fun to try to take on the persona of other people and other activities. That's one of the fun things about being a writer, is to use your own memory when you want to, when there's something you need to write about. As I found my relationship with my mother was something I needed to write about.
Do you learn about yourself when you write?
Oh, yeah, very much.
Could you give us an example, or is that an inappropriate question?
I can't give an exact example, but I'll tell you that something I have mentioned before about writing poetry is that if you really are honest with yourself and you really keep pushing, you get to a level and you think, I hadn't pushed on this one far enough. I have to push further on this idea. And you keep pushing, you'll come up with things that you don't quite understand. You'll come up with an idea, an image, a thought. You write it down, and later, maybe a year or 2 later, you'll read that poem and you will think, how did I know then, 2 years ago, that this was going to happen or that I was going to feel this way? In other words, you know yourself better than you think you do. And poetry is a way to get at some of the things you already know about yourself, but you haven't allowed your conscious mind to deal with it yet.
Do you write at times when you can tap into that subconscious, like just before you go to sleep, or May Sarton writes just as she wakes up?
After a few martinis.
After a few martinis.
No, I don't have any magic formula of timing or place. Something will come to me and I'll start just worrying with it. I'd have to write with a pen pencil. I can't write on typewriter or word processor, and I have to write, just keep working on it until it starts emerging.
Can I change the subject just a little
Sure.
bit? Who has influenced your writing? You were mentioning before we started how somebody like Eudora Welty has maybe influenced other people. How about yourself?
I was very much influenced by James Dickey. And the reason for that is that when I was in school, I was studying the modernists, and I was studying people like Eliot, Yeats, Wallace Stevens, and poets like that. And for the few women I studied, they were Elizabeth Bishop, Marian Moore, who were all modernist poets, and I really wasn't quite sure I understood what they were. They weren't talking to me about anything I was interested in. And one day I opened up the New Yorker magazine, and James Dickey's now famous poem, Falling, was published in that magazine. And I don't know if I can say that was the one day that I thought that I could write poetry, but the fact is that Jim Dickey wrote and writes about interesting subjects, whereas before to me poetry had been boring. And that started it, and then I started reading. I was very much influenced by Sylvia Plath, because mainly, not because of her very despairing and depressing subjects, although I found them very interesting too. I'm not afraid of despair. Even though she put her head in the oven, it still doesn't frighten me. What I loved about Sylvia Plath's poetry is the sounds, the way she understood how you can put words together and make them sound good together, and I love that. I think you have to love the oral effects of words to be interested in poetry too. You have to. It's not just the content. You have to be real interested in words.
Which is probably why you like to do poetry readings.
I love to give readings. Yeah.
Do you read your poetry out loud as you write it? Or can you
Yes.
hear it? You do?
Yes. After I've gotten to a certain point, I read it in the shower or somewhere and see how it sounds.
Are you concerned with rhythm?
Very much.
Do you
In
s-
fact, that's what dictates the line breaks in
Okay.
free verse poetry. When you heard me read, you didn't have any idea where I've broken the lines. But for instance, in the Heron, the moment between what was and what wasn't or what isn't has to shock, and then the line is broken at the word shock, and then the poem comes back around like the Heron. And each one of those line breaks is determined by this sound. I'm punching in those last words.
the last words of each line?
Yes. Yeah.
When you write, can you tell us a little bit about how you write? You know, people have sometimes written whole essays on how they write.
Can I have some water?
Can you have some water? Yeah, sure. I was talking to a poet the other day, and she has 30 notebooks, and in every notebook she has a poem going. I can't imagine writing like that, but how do you do it?
Well, I have one notebook, and I have, right now, I would say about 10
Aha.
going, in various stages. I have a folder that is, as I feel that one is finished, it goes into that folder, but these are not finished either, really. So I guess I have two working.
How do you know when a poet
folded.
is finished?
Well, you just don't. That's what I mean. But But there is the time when I think I'm through working on that one, and so that's one notebook of so-called finished ones. And now, when I got the manuscript, my editor at LSU sent back the manuscript for this. I still made changes in it.
Do you think you'll change anything else when you go to another edition?
I was reading a couple of them today, and last night, and I made changes from the way they're
As you
printed.
read it.
Little ones.
Sure.
Little ones.
Sure, not major changes. What, obviously, are you, you're writing every day, I suspect you're writing every week. What are you working on right now?
Just very much the same thing. It's not. I don't have any overall project for the book. I'm just writing poems.
You're a poet who compiles many poems until she has a manuscript and then sends it
I'd
off.
like very much to try to work another way. I was talking to my friend Margaret Gibson. His fourth book of poetry has just come out, and she has written a book recently that had an overall theme that she wrote the poems for the theme, and she said it was so much easier.
Ah, and you're thinking of doing that?
I'd like to try that.
Are you
I
thinking
just
of a
haven't-
theme? I'm sorry,
I,
cut you off.
I have a vague idea, but nothing that's has come to my mind to write about now fits into it. So there went that idea.
There went that idea. We have time for perhaps a minute more of conversation, and I know that sometimes sitting on the other side you wish you had been asked this question or you wish you had been asked another question. It's your final minute to tell the city of Jacksonville something about poetry or something about yourself. What would you like to tell us?
Well, I could tell what I've told to both of the readings I've given the audiences here in Jacksonville and have said often. I think to hear poetry is even more difficult than to read poetry, and a lot of times I will tell a friend of mine or an old college chum or my children, my teenagers, my teenage students that I am going to a poetry reading, and they'll say, "Oh, boring." They can't imagine anything more boring, because poetry's boring enough as it is, right? So if you go to hear one, that's even worse. But my advice to people is give it a try. Give it at least one try to go to a poetry reading, and you might go to a really boring one. I can't say they wouldn't. But give it a try and listen for the images. Don't try to understand the message. Just listen to the imagery that's being read to you and try to picture it in your mind's eye. And I think that if that's the best advice I can give to people to approach poetry, and not be scared of it. Just let the images work on them.
Buffy, thank you for joining us today. Elizabeth Seydel Morgan has joined us at Worth Quoting, sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. Elizabeth Seydel Morgan was brought to Jacksonville by Calliope, a Journal of Women's Art, and the Koger Foundation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sue. Enjoyed it.